Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill Jeffway. I'm the Executive Director of the Dutchess County Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you tonight to hear Will Tatum talk about the 300th anniversary of Dutchess County Courts and the origins of ancient documents. So I consider Will not only a colleague, but a good friend, and he's also a neighbor. So as long as we don't have lightning storms in Northern Dutchess tonight, we're going to be fine. We're very lucky to have Will because as good as his research is, it's equally entertaining and informative in terms of presentation. So we're very lucky for that. I want to also thank this month's sponsor for the virtual event space. Jim and Margaret Nelson are sponsoring our virtual event space. And every time we have a sponsor, like Jim and Margaret Nelson this time, it means we can bring all this programming both live and archived at no cost to the public. So we're grateful for them. And Will, the floor is yours, as they say.
All right, good evening, everyone. I am going to share my screen now. So the origins of the ancient documents, the 300th anniversary of the Dutchess County Courts. So for those who have been paying attention on Facebook, you'll note that just last week on July 6th, 2021, we had the actual date at which the Dutchess County Courts were authorized, which of course 300 years previously was July 1721. And in our presentation tonight, we're going to cover a big slice of history leading up to the actual first sitting, or at least our earliest records of that first sitting of the county courts. This is all of the stuff that is the preface for the ancient documents presentations that we've been giving you for more or less the past 8 years since we first began our digitization project in 2013. And of course, even though we're not going to be touching on ancient documents tonight, we still need to give a little bit of a shout out to our ancient document search portal. You can see the landing page down there at the bottom. Click on that link or record it. And you too can access now approximately 56,000 pages of court filings, which in this case date from 1721 to about 1840. The collection as a whole are all of the miscellaneous records and court filings of the Dutchess County Courts of Common Pleas and General Sessions between 1721 and 1889. Some of this material, as the genealogists and other researchers may be familiar, was indexed by Henry Noble McCracken, the former president of Vassar College back in the 1950s. But since 2012, we have here at the county clerk's office and the Department of History been going through a lengthy process of indexing and imaging every single sheet of paper, blank pages, as well as pages that have material written on them, both to ensure that these items are preserved for the future and also to grant easy access to them for you. So moving forward, our presentation tonight, instead of focusing on these stories from the ancient documents, will instead trace all of the drama, and there's plenty of drama, that led to the formation of those courts of common pleas and general sessions that generated all of those filings, heard all of those cases, and preserved all of the stories that we usually talk about. And the reason why we need to understand that backstory, that preface, is that throughout the colonial period, and I know that the judges and attorneys and other legal professionals will probably be pretty pleased to hear this, but throughout the colonial period, the courts really were the locus of authority in every county and every community and the colony of New York. It's essentially the courts, and then it jumps up at a certain point to the Colonial Assembly and then to the governor and his council. So the courts are very important in a way that we really don't think of them now today, because today we have municipal governments and county governments that are elected that have the authority to pass local laws. But before 1950, that was not the case. And really before the Constitution of 1820 here in New York State, the courts were still the preeminent local authority. Our presentation is going to go way, way back, much further back than I usually go, before, in fact, the formation of Dutchess County, to 1664, when the English initially take over the Dutch colony of New Netherland and the city of New Amsterdam. And our goal tonight, rather than telling the stories that come out of this court, is to trace that larger context by which the Dutchess County Courts of Common Pleas and General Sessions are formed. And this is a big story. It covers all kinds of 17th century stuff that we don't talk about, because that falls between the end of the Dutch occupation and the start of the American Revolution. And it is also linked to a lot of things that are happening back in England and in Europe more generally. So you'll see me painting with a pretty broad brush tonight. We're not going to get into too much of the nitty gritty, but because I love court procedure just as much as the judges and other legal professionals, you will see occasional nods to pretty tiny details that have a lot of importance. There is, however, one thing that we will not be talking about tonight, and that is the impact of Dutch law in New York, and specifically in colonial New York. As you'll see, there are some references to Dutch law during the English period, but we're not going to get into how it might and might not have affected court operations up until 1721. However, if you do want to learn about that, you're very lucky, because there's a wonderful edited volume produced by our own Al and Julia Rosenblatt that is out there, Opening Statements, published back in 2013, with a series of essays that trace the Dutch impact on New York's legal system, both in the colonial period and all the way through to pretty close to the modern era. The other thing that we're going to make a slight reference to, but is hiding behind all of this stuff, is the catastrophic New York Capitol court fire New York Capitol fire up in Albany on March 29th, 1911. That fire began in the morning. It effectively burned all day long, took the Capitol building down to mostly its frame, and in the process destroyed the archives of the state of New York, which had been lodged in that building. And you can see on your left there a postcard that's towards the middle of the fire. It's still going, although they're getting it under control. And then on your right, you see a photo from the State Library documenting what was left of the archives of the state and colony of New York after that fire. And that particular pile of pages on the table there was identified by the state librarian at that time as the remnants of John James Audubon's plates for his Birds of North America. So that gives you an idea of the level of carnage in the records. And as a result of that fire, for most of the colonial and even the early Republic history of New York, we are now completely dependent upon the transcripts of materials made and published during the 19th century. So for a lot of the laws that we'll be talking about now, we can no longer go back to look at the original copies from which the transcripts were made. And unfortunately, as we'll also touch on later in the presentation, we know that there were items in the state library that died in the Capitol fire that have particular provenance to Dutchess County and would have filled in details about the establishment of the courts and life and governance in early Dutchess County that are just gone forever now. So unfortunately, and in contrast to our neighboring states, we have lost a great deal of our early history. However, we can still fill in the blanks, especially on a broad level, and more or less connect you with the major events and people that populate the story of how Dutchess County came to have its courts and why those courts are such an important thing. So we'll begin our story in 1664, but actually back in 1661. So many folks know that in August of 1664, this huge English invasion fleet appears out of the blue in New York Harbor. Peter Stuyvesant takes one look at it, talks to the town council of New Amsterdam, and they kind of decide that maybe it's a better idea to surrender rather than to try to go ahead and fight these guys and defend the city. Because even though they do have defenses, you can see a fort there down in the sort of the middle ground of the city. It has a wall, it has gates, it doesn't have soldiers, and it doesn't have a heck of a lot of artillery, whereas the English invasion fleet has plenty of both. However, what we don't hear about as frequently is that this plan for invading New Netherland was not something that just occurred to the English in 1664. It actually goes all the way back to the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660. So as some of you may remember, Charles I loses his head in 1649. The old joke is that he is the only British sovereign to end his reign shorter than when he began it. And then his sons are sent away to France. They have various and sundry hijinks in terms of making their escapes, where they hang out at the French court, sometimes up in the Dutch Netherlands, bouncing back and forth until 1660. Oliver Cromwell has died. His son isn't really working out as Lord Protector. So Parliament decides maybe it's time to just invite the king back. Monarchy is restored in 1660. And by 1661, Charles II, who's now king, and his brother James, who is the Duke of York and Albany, are looking over the colonial situation. And one of the things they notice is that they have colonies in New England, lots of folks in New England. They have colonies in the mid-Atlantic. But between those two areas is this rather bothersome Dutch enclave that happens to be occupying the finest natural harbor and arguably in North America, some would say in the Northern Hemisphere. But it's really a pain, and they don't feel required to, in any way, shape, or form, recognize the sovereignty of the Dutch claim here. So they begin in 1661 planning on how they are going to get rid of the Dutch, join all of their colonies into one happy eastern seaboard, and also introduce perhaps a better model of running these colonies, one that provides more power and more revenue to the English crown and perhaps a few less rights to the folks who actually live in these areas. This brings us into the Anglo-Dutch Wars. So that 1664 invasion is part of what sets off the second Anglo-Dutch War. The first Anglo-Dutch War actually happens in the 1640s and is an outgrowth of the English Civil War. In the second war, which is fought between 1665 and 1667, the English and the Dutch battle it out worldwide. The Dutch take some English colonies in South America and in the East Indies, so over around India. The English take some Dutch possessions. They hold on to New Netherland. And at Breda, 1667, the peace treaty essentially decides, all right, whatever each of these parties has at the time, they keep. So the Dutch keep places like Suriname in South America, and the English keep New Netherland and New Amsterdam. This lasts for almost 10 years, 9 years and change, when there is a third Anglo-Dutch War, thankfully the final Anglo-Dutch War. And in July of 1673, the Dutch show back up in New York Harbor. The English decide that it's probably a good time to surrender. The Dutch hold the colony for not quite a year because the Treaty of Westminster in February of 1674 returns all of those possessions to England. So effectively what happens in 1617 or 1674 instead of 1667 is it's all right, we've had a war, we've decided to stop fighting, let's all go back to the way things were before this third war started. However, there have been some important things that happen between those two second and third Dutch Anglo or Anglo-Dutch wars that have a bearing on the establishment of the court system in the colony of New York. So the first thing that happens, and again, August 1664 is when the English arrive in New York Harbor and take over everything. In March of 1664, thinking ahead, just presuming that everything will go perfectly, Charles II makes a royal grant of the territory of New Netherland and Long Island and a couple of other English places in the circuit and orbit of New Netherland to his brother James. Tells his brother James, you know what, we're so close, you can effectively establish whatever laws you want to govern this territory. Don't really worry about English common law, don't worry about Parliament, just consider this to be your personal principality. You know, just give me a heads up if you're going to do anything weird. James turns around and appoints a fellow named Richard Nichols, one of his clients, one of his inner circle, also a colonel in the British Army, or the English Army at this point in time. It's before the Act of Union, to be governor of New York. You know, presuming that everything is going to go okay. So Richard Nichols sails off to America with his invasion fleet in 1664. They arrive. Everything goes okay. Not normally how things work in these circumstances. The Dutch turn things over pretty immediately, and Richard Nichols sits down to figure out, all right, we have now all of New Netherland, including all of Long Island, which has some English claims and possessions and settlements on it. How are we going to govern this new territory? And he's got some vague directions from James, the Duke of York, on how to do this. that are drawn somewhat from how James governs his estates back in England, because these manorial courts are still kind of a thing. The 17th century is a confusing time, legally speaking. So Nichols creates the Shire of Yorkshire in what is now New York, which is not confusing at all when there is still the Shire of Yorkshire in what is then and now England. And that Shire of Yorkshire, like the Shire of Yorkshire in England, is going to have 3 ridings. These are more or less court divisions. The riding comes from the idea that your court officials are riding around holding court at different localities within these divisions. So these ridings are Long Island, Staten Island, and most of what is now modern Westchester County. You'll notice that that does not include Manhattan. It does not include Esopus or what becomes Kingston. It doesn't include Fort Orange, which is modern Albany. All of that area that the Dutch had been governing was more or less left to the Dutch to continue governing as long as they paid their taxes on time and didn't make much of a trouble. So Nichols effectively focuses solely on this new Shire of Yorkshire, and don't worry, it doesn't survive after the Third Anglo-Dutch War. Things will become much more clear, insofar as anything is clear in the 17th century at that point. But he sends out these organizational instructions, and he tells everyone, all right, you're going to have a high sheriff for the whole thing, the entire Shire, a deputy sheriff for each of these ridings, and then justices of the peace in each of these ridings, all of whom are going to be appointed by the governor and effectively serve as long as the governor is happy with this situation. You're also going to have a court of sessions that would sit 3 times a year, presided over by a governor or the senior justice. And this would, there would also be a court of assizes that would convene annually at NYC. So again, this is what covers the Shire of Yorkshire, those English possessions, nowhere where the Dutch are living in 1664. So in 1665, one of the first things that happens is there is a gathering of justices and delegates from across Long Island, just Long Island, not Staten Island, not modern Westchester County, at Hempstead, to more or less approve, pass these laws known as the Duke's Laws, most of which are covered in that initial organizing directions given out by Nichols in March of 1664. Now, among other things, at this March 1st, 1665 gathering, Nichols promises to all of these delegates from Long Island that he is going to convene a General Assembly of delegates drawn from throughout this new Shire of Yorkshire. Might have been nice if they called it the Shire of New Yorkshire, but never mind. And he's going to convene it at some undisclosed point in the future, and then they'll be able to start making their own laws like their friends up in the New England colonies can do, like their friends in the mid-Atlantic and southern colonies can do. Those Duke's laws continue to only apply to Yorkshire, that English part of the colony, until after that Third Anglo-Dutch War. So in November of 1674, new governor Edmund Andros arrives, and the first thing that he does, with orders from James to do this, and remember at this point in time, James is not the king, he's still Duke of York, but the entire colony of New York is basically his personal backyard. So Andros has orders, make those Duke's laws apply everywhere. Eliminate Dutch law, eliminate Dutch office holders, just get rid of them because it really didn't work out in that experimental phase. And as far as we can see, these laws remain until effect, at least until 1687, when things start to get weird again, and potentially until they're superseded in 1691. And what you've got there in terms of the photo is a copy of, there are 2 at least surviving copies of these laws because they were not at the New York Capitol in 1911. This copy is still held today by the Huntington Town Clerk down on Long Island. All right, so what exactly is it that these courts do in more detail? This is a shout out to the judges and the attorneys who are in the room tonight. And you can see on the side of your screen there, that image is from the part of the original Duke's laws that talk about court administration. Well, first of all, you're going to have that court of assizes that meets once per year in September in New York City to try capital crimes, hear major cases and complaints, and effectively act as a colonial assembly or legislature. So this is the point in time where all right, there's been a vague promise made that there's going to be an assembly, but really, no, the high court of the colony is going to act as an assembly. This law also establishes 3 courts of sessions that meet in each of those ridings 3 times a year. So you have 3 meetings in Long Island, you have 3 meetings in Staten Island, and 3 meetings in whatever is in modern Westchester in the 1660s. And those are going to be in June, December, and March. It also states that the governor appoints the justices of the peace and the high sheriff, but that constables are elected by a voice vote in town meetings. And you can imagine how well organized that was. The only other municipal officers that are authorized by these codes are overseers. These are just described as overseers of the parishes. They're not overseers of the poor, for those who have heard some of our previous presentations on Tales from the Ancient Documents. But together, the constable and the overseers of each of these towns more or less runs the show. And it expressly says they can hold town courts for non-criminal offenses, which seems a little, I don't know, contradictory, because why would you have a court to try something that's not criminal? I mean, technically you have civil cases, but they're pretty clear that this is only to resolve administrative disputes in the towns. So again, it's the justices, the constables, and the sheriffs who really run the show as the local authorities. Not to miss a beat, the Duke's laws also establish a comprehensive fee schedule for what the sheriffs, the constables, and the justices can charge for their various services. And in case someone somehow missed the boat that, oh yeah, the court officials are the major officials in this colony, it ends by saying, yes, it's nice that you elect these local officials, but the justice of your riding or the sheriff of the Shire of Yorkshire can walk in and preside at any town meeting at any time, as well as issue writs and warrants. So the big takeaway here is the courts are the big thing. We fast forward now to 1683. There's a new governor. There's a pretty reasonable turnover in office. Of course, Sir Edmund Andros is doing other things at this time. We'll get back to him shortly. A little hint there that there's a big change between Edmund Andros and Sir that has something to do with what happens to James II. And in 1683, Thomas Dongan, who effectively sets up most of the New York legal system, at least the bare bones of it, as we still know today, as well as the county system, arrives in the colony. And he strangely has with him a note in his directions from James that, okay, you can go ahead and hold a colonial assembly. This is weird because the entire time that Edmund Andros had been governor of New York, James had been writing him letters saying, whatever you do not allow the people of this colony to elect representatives and hold an assembly, because the only thing that assemblies are good for is getting in the way of governance and making a headache for the government. So don't do it under any circumstances ever. 1683, he's had a little bit of a change of heart, and it doesn't completely last, because the first thing that assembly does when they meet on October 17th is they try to effectively pass a Bill of Rights. It's a list of liberties that are somewhat stated, somewhat hinted at that royal charter that was first given out in 1664 when the Dutch were still in charge, before the English had even arrived. There's a new charter that's given out in 1674 that supersedes that earlier charter, because the Dutch have run the colony for 9 months, and maybe it's important to reassert royal prerogative here. And because they now have had 2 charter changes in less than a decade, the people of New York are a little worried about their rights, and they want to seal the deal on these things. That is the only thing that this first assembly does, the only act that they pass that James vetoes once it gets back to him in England. And of course, as more or less the proprietor of this colony, he has complete veto power. His brother is not worried about having to review this stuff, in contrast to every other colony. The only really great thing that this assembly does for us, it's really important though, is they set up the first initial 12 counties of New York, among which is Dutchess County. By the Revolutionary era, which we're going to make some hints to, but not actually get to. We're down to 10 counties in New York because of some land swaps with Connecticut. And the folks who are tuning in from the Oblong, and a big shout out to the Strausses, I see you on today. You are in Dutchess County now, courtesy of us losing 2 of those original 12 counties to Connecticut. All right, here's where things begin to get weird and European stuff starts to affect what's happening in New York and in North America in general. So Charles II, the great party king, if you get a chance to read any bios of him, I mean, the man was a constant party animal that looms large in his life. And his partying got so hard that he dies in February of 1685. And he's succeeded by his brother James, who's now no longer the Duke of York and Albany. He's now King James II of England. He's King James VII of Scotland, because again, this is before the union of the crowns. And James has had some ideas about government, about how to run things in North America that he wasn't quite sure was going to pass muster for his brother. But now that his brother is out of the picture, he can do what he wants. We mentioned earlier that Edmund Andros has been out of the picture, and he returns as Sir Edmund Andros because James II likes him. He's now king. He can knight whoever he wants. And James II decides, all right, New England, major headache, because each of these colonies has its own charter, and they are extremely defensive of these charters. And these charters were not by and large given out by his brother. They were given out by his father, Charles I, or in some cases, arguably by his grandfather, James I. So he's now had the time to experiment with more or less direct proxy rule, which means, yeah, he's not signing all of the paperwork in New York, but the guy he appointed is, and he doesn't have to deal with any real colonial assemblies because his governor takes care of that and he has veto power. So why can't we make this dream a reality in New England as well? Get rid of all those complaints from Massachusetts, from Connecticut, from Rhode Island. Well, he does this in 1685. He creates the Dominion of New England. He yanks all of those colonial charters, says, too bad, so sad. You now answer to my personal close friend, Sir Edmund Andros. Sends him over to Massachusetts to more or less run the show from Boston. Time passes, 1688. Things are going relatively well, or at least as well as Edmund Andros is reporting. Around this time, there's lots of fighting with the French up along the Canadian border, which more or less keeps the New Englanders, it takes their minds off the whole problem of having lost their own proprietary governments. So in 1688, James II says, let's just make it all one. So he adds New York and the Jerseys into the Dominion of New England. The timing is slightly problematic, however, because in November of 1688, November 5th, the same day that Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament and James II's namesake and predecessor, James I, a guy named William of Orange from the Netherlands, you might be hearing a little tune of Dutch revenge here, lands in the West Country and the city of Exeter and sparks the Glorious Revolution. By February of 1689, they're new sovereigns in town because William and his wife Mary, who is James II's daughter by his first marriage, are now sovereigns of Great Britain. This news arrives in America. Everyone is super happy to hear this. So all of those New England states say, great, now that James II is gone, we're going to revert to our earlier charters and run things the way that we like to do. We're going to jail Sir Edmund Andros because we don't like him very much. So he goes in the clink in Boston. And we're going to begin to consider the concept of witch trials. Meanwhile, in New York, a guy named Jacob Leisler decides we should follow New England's example here. He overthrows a lieutenant governor, a guy named Nichols, and establishes control over New York, both the city and really the southern part of the colony, not all the way up to Albany, and rules from 1689 until March 1691. Calls in at least one assembly to vote new taxes, and generally seems to do a pretty good job. Not too many complaints against Jacob Leisler. Things go terribly wrong for him, however, in March of 1691, because that is when a new governor, aptly named Henry Slaughter, arrives from London. Slaughter has commissioned as governor. He also has orders to try and execute Jacob Leisler as quickly as possible because, yeah, Jacob did a pretty good job, but we don't want to set a precedent of overthrowing royal governors. It's bad optics. So Leisler's executed in March of 1691, and then in April, in order to sort of calm down everyone, reassure folks that constitutional government, insofar as you get constitutional government in the 17th century, is back again, Governor Slaughter calls an assembly. One of the things that assembly does is on May 6th, they pass an act that completely overhauls that court system. So now we get what is more or less the modern county court system pre-unification of the courts. So of course, today you have more or less one court if you don't count family court. Back then you had two. So every county in New York now gets two courts. You have your court of general sessions. And if you really want to go the full 12 miles, it's the Court of General Sessions of the Peace. This is going to meet twice a year in each of these counties. In Ulster County, it meets in September and March. And that is for a maximum. And judges, I want you to consider this for a moment. Your maximum court session is 2 days to try everything on your docket of a criminal nature. And if you don't get through it in 2 days, then it waits until the next court date. And that's a real problem for anyone who has been jailed instead of given bail, because if their court case isn't heard in session 1, they have to remain in jail for another 6 months. And as far as what we can tell about how these sessions tended to run, because we don't have court minutes surviving until really the 1750s that are comprehensive, these sessions would have begun at sunup and ended whenever the judge got tired enough at night to close it down. So you're talking about more than 12 hours as a normal day at court. So each of these counties gets one of these courts, except for Dutchess County, which is annexed to Ulster, and that's why you have a photo of the Ulster County Courthouse in Kingston there, and Orange County, which is annexed to the County of New York. The other court that these counties get is the Court of Common Pleas, which handily is described as hearing any sort of case that is cognizable under common law. So that means more or less civil cases, neighbor complaining against neighbor, go to the Court of Common Pleas. Criminal cases, anything versus the crown, so assault, counterfeiting, slander of a certain variety, generally slander against public officials, these go to the Court of General Sessions. The session sits first for 2 days maximum. And the law actually says, maybe you can get rid of all of this business in 1 day. If you can, please do it. Then the general sessions sit immediately afterwards. No, sorry, the general sessions first, the common sessions or the common pleas sit immediately afterwards. The general sessions is supposed to be all of the justices of the peace presiding. The common pleas is one judge and two justices of the peace presiding. This law also establishes the sheriffs as more or less the lackeys of the judges and the justices. So the sheriffs are directed to execute all of the writs, the summons, and the judgments that the justices or judges come up with. The law also establishes the clerk of the court, which is the beginning of the system of county clerks, both for maintaining all of the records, all of these filings that are now the ancient documents here in Dutchess County, and also for issuing all of the processes and writs, which is where we get all of our receiving clerks and registry clerks here today. And finally, there is a Supreme Court of Judicature set up down in New York City that meets twice a year in October and April, and here's the really super serious crimes as well as any causes over 20 pounds in value, which is a tremendous amount of money at this point in time. So that's 1691. Dutchess County is more or less under Ulster County. If you want to do any kind of business, you've got to go to court. And if you're going to go to court, you have to row across the river, go to Esopus, and then walk all the way up to Kingston to what is now the Stockade District. This is pretty bothersome. So throughout the 1690s and the first decade of the 18th century, the the high and mighties of Dutchess County, particularly Leonard Lewis, are continually sending letters to the Colonial Assembly and to the governor saying, please, please, let us have our own government. I know there aren't a whole lot of people here, but really we can make it work. What finally pushes the Colonial Assembly to pass a law in the fall of 1713, which does not establish in and of itself government in 1713. It establishes government in 1714 with elections happening in April. What finally pushes that into being is back taxes. Because this whole time from the 1690s up until 1713, the Colonial Assembly had been voting tax levies every year because you've got to pay for colonial government, you've got to pay the governor's salary. There's a lot of charges that need to be met. And every year, this is levied on all of the counties, regardless of whether they have courts or not. So the justices, the assessors over in Ulster County are expected to, again, row across the river to Dutchess County, travel around, figure out where everybody lives, what their property is worth, how much of X, Y, and Z act they have to pay. And you can imagine that if it's really hard to get someone from Poughkeepsie to drive to Eastern Dutchess today, how much harder it was to get someone who lives west of Kingston to make their way over to anywhere in Dutchess County in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It was not working out. And our first book of supervisors is filled with lists of all of the back taxes that are owed to the colonial government. So it's finally taxation that gets it pushed through. So 1714, they're allowed to elect their first officers in April. They sit in October, and really their first purpose is try to collect some of these taxes and then to set up everything that needs to be done to elect people in April of 1715 to then really establish Dutchess County government. And the plan is 1715, you're going to have the full panoply of county officials elected and established in office. So that's your courts are going to theoretically be formed in 1715. The sheriff's going to start up in 1715. All those constables and assessors are going to start up in 1715. County clerk's office is going to begin then. That's the plan. And we know in part it's the plan because of that letter that you have on the left side of your screen. And this is one of those funny, this is how we know that there were things up in Albany in March of 1911 that would have told us a lot more about what was going on here in Dutchess County at that time. This transcript comes out of the Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook for 1927. And in the article of which this transcript is a part, it states that the fellow who wrote this article had gone up to the state capitol in New York in, I think, 1910, might have been a little earlier, and taken a photograph of this letter because he was a descendant of the Mr. Bradford to which the letter was addressed. And according to this article, a reproduction of this letter was supposed to appear in that yearbook. Unfortunately, it did not. So we have no idea what the original looked like, but this transcript does survive. And, you know, if you can read your way through this, and I find that it helps to read it out loud because then some of the spelling makes sense. What it is Leonard Lewis, who's the leading citizen of Dutchess County at this time, saying to his buddy in the governor's office, hey, you know, I want you to get the governor to appoint me to be the judge in Dutchess County, the judge of the common pleas. I'd like Barent van Cleek, and who was often known as Johannes Terboos, but you know, in English that's John Terboos or Jonathan Terboos, to be my assistant judges. And you know, we'll have Richard Sackett be the clerk. It'll be wonderful. I want you to make this happen right now for next year. We know that doesn't happen, but we know it's planned because then in 1715, same year as that letter, the Colonial Assembly passes a funding bill saying, all right, Dutchess County, you can now collect money specifically to build a courthouse. You've got 2 years to do it, go. And this is where it gets really inconvenient that all that stuff that might have told us what happened in those 2 years, because I'm sure there had to be some correspondence between Dutchess County and Albany or New York City, depending on where the governor was going to be. Some of that had to have been up in Albany in 1911, but burned, because nothing happens on the courthouse front between 1715 and 1717. So much so that in 1717, the Colonial Assembly reissues this authorization to collect tax money with the proviso that, hey, you have failed to do this previously. You better do it by 1720 or you're not getting money for a courthouse. And if you don't have a courthouse, you can't have a court. And if you don't have a court, then guess what? Despite the fact that you have a county clerk and all these other people, you're still going to be rowing across the river to do any kind of business, and no one's going to take you seriously because look at the past decades of history here in New York. Clearly, the court is the locus of authority. You don't matter. You aren't a real county if you don't have a court. Thankfully for Dutchess County, they evidently got their act together, and even in either in 1720 or by 1721, they built a courthouse. We have no idea what it looks like. We do know, however, that it was located at the location of the current courthouse there at Main and Market. And Bill Jeffway has kindly put together this image with a question mark, which is our best idea of what this first courthouse looked like. The second courthouse image is drawn from the FDR paintings. So again, this is kind of an artist's conception of what it might have been like. We do have some bills for maintenance on the courthouse in the 1750s that give us an idea of the dimensions and some of the aspects. We also have this recently discovered doodle on the back of Ink Doc 28,000, which on the front of it is a series of writs issued in January of 1785. So that would have been the first county court or the second county courthouse, which burned in 1787. Really sad because in 1788, Dutchess County had to host New York's ratification convention of the United States Constitution. So throughout 1787 and into 1788, the county rebuilt its courthouse just in time to host Alexander Hamilton, Governor George Clinton, Langton Smith, all those wonderful folks. We have sketches of that courthouse there in the 1804 Dutchess Turnpike map and the 1792 sketch. That burns down in 1806. They build a fourth county courthouse out of stone in 1808, which you can see the photograph thereof in the lower left. That lasts until 1901 when they knock it down to make room for the new county courthouse, which the county has made attempts to knock down several times since then, but thankfully has been defeated each time. So we still have that masterpiece, but all 5 courthouses on the same spot kind of reminds me of a Monty Python joke. But coming back to 300 years this month, last week, July 6th, we finally have proof recorded in that first book of supervisors that the governor has given permission for the county courts to sit, which means courthouse must be ready. The ordinance begins with the governor, William Burnett, saying, all right, I realize there's never been a county court of any variety that is set in Dutchess County. And I guess it's finally time to remedy that. So you're going to get 2 things. First, you're going to get a court of general sessions, which is going to be held in Poughkeepsie. And that ordinance actually talks about Poughkeepsie being a central location. Our friends in Dutchess County would probably debate that fact since they split off in 1812 because Poughkeepsie was so far away. But in 1721, it's central. You're going to hold it in Poughkeepsie. You're going to hold it twice a year, the 3rd Tuesdays of May and October. And again, you've got 2 days to get through all of that business. If you don't get through it in 2 days, is going to have to wait until the next session. Not such a bad thing for the lawyers and judges. Huge thing if you were in the jail that is in the basement of the county courthouse, and by all accounts, not a really pretty place. On the back end of that Court of General Sessions, you're going to have the Court of Common Pleas that will also meet for a maximum of 2 days. And again, this ordinance says, do it in a day if you can. And hey, if you don't need to meet, just forget about that whole meeting of the Court of Common Pleas. No biggie. We'll catch it next year. Not a problem. That's great. So remember, Court of General Sessions is supposed to meet in May and October. It's July 1721. You would expect that the Court of General Sessions at least would meet in October of 1721. However, our earliest surviving evidence for that court meeting, and look who's there, it's Leonard Lewis, the guy who was asking to be made a judge, and Barent von Kleek, one of the 2 people he asked to be made a justice. When are they meeting? November 29th, 1721. So, we here in Dutchess have a lovely 300-year tradition of being a little later than the Albany or New York City government would like us to be. So why are they meeting in November of 1721? What brings them together? Well, they have a complaint, and the complaint is being made by a woman named Sarah Hogeboom, and that lateral it's rendered here, as you can see, is two words, but becomes one word later on in the century, against Elena van den Bogart. And what's the problem here? Oh, it comes down to taxes, because Elena van den Bogart has been running a tavern, which is just fine. Colonial law allows you to do that. However, colonial law says that a certain amount of the money that you make has to be turned over to the government from your liquor sales. There's an excise tax that comes with your license. And the problem here is that Elena van den Bogart has permitted her license to lapse. How unforgivable. And I'm going to bet that Sarah Hogeboom it's not mentioned here, but I'm going to bet that she's probably running a competing tavern, or someone in her family went to the tavern, got drunk, did something unfortunate, and now she's going to try to make trouble for her neighbor Elena van den Bogart on this cause. So how this is resolved is the court decides, all right, Elena van den Bogart, you're going to get your license next year as usual. And until then, just pay what you owe us. We aren't all that worried about it as long as we get our money. That's the important thing. And for your good citizenry there, Sarah, we're going to give you one skipple, or actually, sorry, 3 skipples of wheat, which is a Dutch measurement of wheat. I have no idea what that equals in actual piles of wheat, but that's more or less how they do business in 18th century Dutchess County, is in skipples of wheat rather than in cash. So there you go. The court first meets to hear an issue about an illegal tavern, and it's because a neighbor called in the complaint, and the judges decide, instead of throwing people in jail, we're just going to collect the money and move on with our lives. But that's not all. The final piece that comes out of this first session, and we know this because of what's going to pop up at the second slide here, is that the judges also meet in December 16th, 1721, to hear a land claim settlement. Now, it's not weird for the county courts to be brought in to verify a deed being accurate, because these things are supposed to be filed with the county clerk, who of course is the clerk of court. What's weird about this, but I'm told by folks who have looked into these issues a little more deeply than I have, is that it is very common for land disputes in Ulster to be heard in Dutchess County, and for land disputes in Dutchess County to be heard in Ulster County. This particular land dispute involves Robert Saunders, who of course has his own land patent, what is now Bowden Park, in the town of Poughkeepsie, and a series of Native American chiefs for land that was purchased along the Wallkill over in Ulster County, now pretty close to the border of Ulster County and Orange County. They have this arrangement here. You can see it there transcribed on your screen. Everyone seems happy about it. They went over to Poughkeepsie, and here's the second part of that, to get this all signed, sealed, and delivered. We unfortunately do not have the original deed, so we do not have the marks of those native leaders. We do have what the clerk of the court at the time thought looked like their marks, recorded there on your screen. And then the fact that everything was signed, sealed, and delivered, at least to the satisfaction of the colonial court and the court there in Dutchess County, and also purportedly, at least as far as our records go, to the native chiefs. So right there in your first court session of the Court of General Sessions, you have an alcohol and tax related infringement, and you're also hearing the land issue between Native Americans and settlers. So this is going to be themes that repeat throughout the rest of the court's history, at least during the colonial period, and items that we will touch on for future presentations. So thank you all very much for bearing with me tonight. I hope you enjoyed our voyage through the 17th and early 18th centuries here in Dutchess. I hope it kind of makes sense when I say now that when you think about governance in New York in the colonial period, especially below the level of the assembly, you're really talking about the courts being the centers of government and effectively the legislatures, not so much the boards of supervisors, which exist in Dutchess County at least from 1719. So at this point, I'm going to stop the share and we will open the floor up for any questions. And Bill, I don't know if we had any, well, that works for me. I appreciate you all dedicating your Wednesday night to the 300th anniversary of the Dutchess County Courts, to following us through that weird period between the coolness of the Dutch rule and then all the anger at Great Britain. And I look forward to seeing you for future presentations, both with the County Historical Society and with our array of local historical societies.